Hello again. As you know, I am Eli, and today, as part of the A Plus track, we are going to be talking about computer cases. This is one of those components in a computer that, of course, you need. Of course, you need some place to put the motherboard and the CPU and everything else, but many people forget that this is actually a very important component of the computer that you'll be assembling or of the computer that you're going to be dealing with. In the real world, in the real technical support world, you would be surprised how many issues come about because of the computer case itself, whether it's problems, basically problems with the airflow, problems with cooling, and so that causes computers to freeze up or crash, or simply problems of somebody basically created a computer in the wrong type of case, and then that comes back to bite them in the butt later when you're trying to troubleshoot it and deal with it and maintain it and all of that kind of stuff. So today we're going to be talking about computer cases as far as the A plus certification level goes. And again, this is not something that you should ignore. This is not something you should roll your eyes at, because you don't know how many times, at the end of the day, the problem turns out to be that the computer has just a case that doesn't work for the function of whatever the computer is supposed to do. So with that, let's dive into this class and start talking about computer cases. So the first thing that we need to take a look at is the type of case the computer is going to be within. Now, to be clear, this is not form factor. So when we talk about form factor, we'll talk about that in a minute. Basically, that's the size of the components that go within the case. What we're talking about right now is the type of case. Essentially, is this going to be a tower case? Is this going to be a rack-mounted case? Is this going to be a multimedia center case? What type of case will the components of the computer be going into? Now, it's very important that the form should match function. So a big problem that I see with a lot of noobs is they think, I want a professional computer. So I'm going to go out there and I'm going to buy a rack-mounted case to put my professional computer components in, because that's going to be a professional computer. Well, here's the thing, right? Rack-mounted cases are built to get screwed into to server racks. So essentially, if you're going to have 10, 20, 30 servers all tightly packed together within a server rack, then rack-mounted cases make a lot of sense. If you're just going to be putting all your components into this rack-mounted case and then sitting it on your desk or sitting on the floor or something, probably doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not built for that. I mean, something you have to be thinking about with the types of cases is things like airflow. How is the air supposed to flow through the case? And so, like, if you have a rack-mounted case, air is supposed to flow from the front to the back, because you have all of these servers compacted together. Basically, they're really tight together in the server rack, so that there's not a lot of airflow to up or down or left or right. It has to go from front to back. In the server rack, that makes a lot of sense. Again, in your desk or in another environment, that may not make a lot of sense. So it's very important to be thinking about the type of case that you're going to need for the function that you're going to be using the computer for. So let's go over to newegg.com and take a look at some of the different types of cases that there are. So this is the basic tower type case. So if we look at this, we see ATX. So ATX is as a form factor, basically a form factor for components. So you have ATX full towers, ATX mid towers, micro ATX towers, mini ITX towers. Basically, when you're taking a look at tower computers, these are essentially computers that stand vertically. This is probably the standard type of computer you're used to nowadays. And the idea with this is most likely going to be sitting on the floor beside your desk. You'll notice, like on this ATX tower, this large one right here, is that it has little feet on the bottom of it. Well, the reason why you have little feet on the bottom of a tower like this is it keeps it off the ground a little bit. So imagine if you have a big gulp. Let's say you have a big soda and you accidentally drop the soda on the ground. Well, if you have feet like this, then the soda drops on the ground. It gets under your computer. I mean, you've got a disgusting mess to clean up, but it's probably not going to cause any major problems for the computer. On the other hand, imagine if you have a rack-mounted computer that doesn't have those little feet on the bottom. You have that sitting on the ground. You spill the soda, and then all of a sudden that soda is now actually leaking into the case itself. you run into problems. And so this is the type of thing you need to be thinking about the type of case. Now we talk about rack-mounted cases. This is like an iStar USA rack-mounted case. I think this is a 4U, so something called a 4U. We'll talk about this later, and maybe like server hardware or something. Basically, this gets screwed into a server rack. That's why you see these little ears on the side of the case. And again, it looks a little bit different. So there's no feet on the bottom. Basically, everything is built here. Again, airflow and such is supposed to go from front to back. And basically, this has its own little functions. Again, you'll see things like here, like if you see on the front, since this is supposed to be in a server room, there's actually a lock. This is a key lock. The idea is you can lock these front hot swappable doors so that nobody can just simply reach in and try to steal your hard drives if you're trying to deal with things like data security. Now, there are other types of cases out there. These are Mediacenter cases. Again, when you start talking about form function, so let's say you're going to have a Mediacenter computer that's going to be sitting by your 42-inch big screen TV. Now, if you have something like that, you probably don't want a lot of RGB, you don't want a lot of colors, you don't want a rack-mounted case, you want something a little bit smaller, basically something that just sits there and does its job. And so that's what we're dealing with one of these Mediacenter cases. Now, you also hear I talked about the mini ITX cases. So mini ITX cases, these are the smaller cases. Now, these aren't the really small cases. These aren't nukes. There's Intel nukes, and Intel nukes are like really small, like 4 inches by 4 inches or something. These are the smaller cases. So basically, you're talking about like a foot by a foot. But basically, these can be good for building, again, like Mediacenter computers or smaller servers, smaller appliances, that type of thing. When you think about the ITX boards are the smaller square boards that you can use. So these are the different types of cases, or some of the different types of cases that you can use in order to build your computer, or that you might be using for your computer. And so this is something to be thinking about. Again, you think about things like airflow. So if you're going to be putting it into an environment, how is air going to be flowing through this case? Is it appropriate for the environment that you're going to be in? Again, is this a dirty environment? Is it going to be on the floor? Is it going to be on a server rack? If it's going to be on the floor, it sounds stupid, but having little feet on the bottom of your computer might save it from, again, soda or water or other crap. And this is something that you need to be thinking about with the form and the function of the computer. And so what type of case will you be using for whatever the computer is going to be used for? So the next thing that we need to talk about with cases is the form factor of the case. So basically, when you go out there, obviously you know that you can get different size computers, and obviously there are different size components within different size computers. But the thing is, by and large, those sizes have been standardized. So you have full-size ATX components, you have micro ATX, you have ITX. All this means is different sizes. Now, hopefully it's not going to come as a shock. But if you have components, you need to have components that can actually fit within the case. So if you have a full-size ATX board, and then you buy a micro ATX case, do a little logic here, 2 plus 2, full-size board, micro case, the board probably will not be able to fit inside the case. So this is something you're going to have to be thinking about, especially if you're going to be building computers, or if you have to replace parts, making sure you get the right size for the form factor. Now, it's very important. Again, shouldn't be too complicated to understand, but smaller components generally can go in larger cases. So if you have a micro ATX board, can go into an ATX case. Obviously, a full ATX board most likely cannot go into a micro ATX case. Sounds goofy, sounds funny, but this can really get you into trouble. Now, whenever you're dealing with cases, especially if you're going to be buying them, the way to know what size boards can go into the case and what size components can go into the case, it's pretty easy. You can actually just go to the web page wherever they're selling it, or onto the manufacturer's site, scroll down, and you can see the details, and you can see the different the different form factors for the devices that will go into it. So you can see here, power supply. So you get a full-size ATX power supply. So we go motherboard compatibility, and so this shows you right here what motherboard sizes can go in. So you can have a micro ATX go into this particular case. You can have an ATX board, or you can have a mini ITX board. So it's just very important to understand, as far as the motherboards are concerned and some other components are concerned, there's different sizes, and so just making sure you buy the right sizes, and so everything fits together. Now, I will warn you that there are some issues with proprietary computers whenever you buy them, especially from the big manufacturers. So especially from companies like Dell. Nowadays, everybody generally goes with the same types of boards, but you will run into problems with things like power supplies. So this particular desktop computer has a special sized power supply. So if you're going to replace a power supply, that might run you into trouble. I've had this issue in the real world, with HP or Lenovo, that they'll have very specific, they won't use a standard ATX power supply. They'll use their own weird size power supply, which of course, surprise, ends up costing about 3 times as much. You're like, well, I could have bought you a normal power supply for $50, but you have to have a custom power supply for this particular case, and so that's going to cost you $150. Again, all we're talking about with a form factor is the sizes of the components that go within the case. Generally, everything is standardized off of ATX, micro ATX, or ITX, but again, with any of these custom systems, sometimes you can run into specific components and you have to buy the specific replacements. You can't just buy something off the shelf. Now, one of the main functions that you're going to need to be thinking about with your computer cases nowadays is the cooling component. So being able to keep all the components within your computer cool. Now, this isn't the old days, right? When I was young, in my early 20s, my friends and I, we thought we were all being all nifty neat by keeping the sides off of our cases to show how we need to keep our components, as cool as possible so that they could really crunch some data. And honestly, we had our heads up our butts, right? You go back to 2000, 2002, you didn't have a lot of cooling problems with PCs. Maybe some servers if they were really chugging along, but honestly, if you kept your computer in a room temperature, environment, it had a couple of vents open on the computer case. That's all you really needed to worry about. Well, the thing is, as computers have evolved, they now really have gotten hot. So when you start talking about these modern graphics cards, when you start talking about these modern CPUs, these components get really hot, and it is no longer a cool thing to do to worry about ventilation of your computer. If you don't get it right, your computer will just shut down and things will melt and you will have a very bad day. So you need to be thinking about cooling whenever you're going to be building your computer. One of the first things that you do need to think about is essentially how hot is your computer going to run. Now, to be clear, if you build a little, you get yourself a little i5, you use onboard video, you throw in a solid state drive, you're basically back to the 2002 era of worrying about heat problems with your computer. Yeah, you might run into them if you do something stupid, but probably not. It's not going to be significant. On the other hand, if you're going to be putting a lot of high-end components into your computer, then you will have to worry about heat issues. Again, you get a 1080 Ti or whatever the latest graphics card is, you get a very high-end processor, that is going to be putting off a lot of heat, and therefore you need to worry about the case a little bit more. So when we start talking about heat, one of the things you're going to have to be thinking about is the components that you're going to be putting into the system, and then how much heat is it going to put off. Some little crappy computer for the secretary used to do word processing. You don't have to worry about heat a lot of power, hungry components in there, and heat is going to become a major issue. Now, one of the things that I will say is if you're not worried about space, the larger the case you buy, the easier it is going to be for air circulation within the case. So a lot of people try to get like really small cases, cram everything into the really small case. The problem is you don't get a lot of airflow because everything's all really packed together. And so you have to circulate a lot of air through that case very quickly in order to cool things down. One thing to think about is, you get a micro ATX board and you throw in your video card and you put that in a nice large full-size ATX case. there is a lot of air volume in that case, and therefore it'll be easier to keep the components cool. Just one of those things to be thinking about. So if we go over to Newegg, though, we can take a look at like one of the computer cases, just to take a look at some of the things to be thinking about with your case and about trying to keep your computer cool. Now, one of the things you'll see nowadays, again, depending on what components you put into your system, one of the questions to ask yourself is how many fans should you put on the computer case, right? So that's again a very important thing to think about. You think about the heat sink fan. So you have a heat sink on your CPU, and then there's a fan on that, and so that blows air onto the heat sink to try to keep it cool. You have fans on your GPUs, so your 1080s, your Vega GPUs that you have. Well, here's the thing, right? If you don't have fans either pulling air in or pushing it out of the case, then what happens a lot of times is you have the fans inside the case that are essentially blowing hot air onto hot components, right? So you need to be thinking about how the air is going to get into and then out of the case. How many fans you're going to need for that, that depends on what your overkill is. So with some of these cases, they have front-mounted places where you can put fans. Some of the cases, they have the fans that are in the rear. Some of the cases, they have the fans up top. But this is something that you should be thinking about. Again, how do you actually pull the air through? Then beyond that, looking at the grills, basically how big are the grills, so how much air can actually flow into the computer itself. Now, one of the things that I will warn you, again, being in Baltimore, I dealt with a lot of different environments. As I talk about, I worked from the projects to the penthouse, right? And some people have houses that are cleaner than others. One of the things that I will say, something that you should be thinking about whenever you do buy a case, if you do buy a case, or whenever you're inspecting a case, trying to figure out what's wrong with the computer, is look to see how big the air vent holes are in the case, right? So a lot of these cases nowadays, they'll get built, and basically they'll have like a fine mesh. They'll have some kind of like essentially air filter. So when air gets brought into the case, there's a little filter in front of it. Well, one of the problems is people don't think about that. They never clean those kind of filters, and so the computer will sit on the ground for 2 years, being on 24/7. It essentially ends up being a vacuum cleaner, and then that air filter will get all clogged up. Well, if the air filter gets clogged up or the fine mesh gets all clogged up, then again, the air isn't actually circulating, isn't actually getting into the computer, and then the computer will crash. The other thing that I've seen, you don't see this as much as you used to, but they used to have like hidden air vents. So on the front of the case, instead of having a very obvious air vent like this, they would have like a panel in front of this type of air vent. Again, one of the issues that I saw with people that owned pets is that basically hair would get between that front panel and then the internal air vents, and again, it acts like a vacuum cleaner, gunks everything up, air can't circulate into the computer, and it completely crashes. So those are some of the things you need to be thinking about, again, with the fans, how many fans you're going to want to put on the case, what the grills look like, so on and so forth. The other thing that I'll say, again, for any of the old timers out there, is back in the day, to look cool, we used to have the sides off of our cases, right? So you'd have the computer case on your desk, and then you would pull the side off your computer case just to show everybody, again, that you need to keep your components as cool as possible. And again, that's kind of like one of those 2002 era things. These cases nowadays are built to have a specific type of airflow through the case. And so if you take the side off of some of these cases, especially depending on what kind of components you have, you may end up overheating your components because they don't get the proper airflow through the case. So that, again, that's one of those things to be thinking about with cooling, is sitting there. You know, and that's a problem that people can run into, especially if you're doing something like troubleshooting. So again, for me back in the day, you rip the side off the computer, you're sitting there swapping parts, you're trying to do troubleshooting, trying to figure out why the computer's crashing. Ha, wouldn't it be ironic? Wouldn't it be ironic is it keeps you know, you're sitting there, you have the side of the case off, the computer keeps crashing, you can't figure out why, and it's because if you don't have the side of the case on, it doesn't get the equipment doesn't get the proper airflow, and therefore everything overheats and you look like an idiot. So these are some of the things that you need to be thinking about as far as the case and the cooling is concerned. Ah, times have changed. Times have changed. I am so behind the times. I crap you not. I crap you not. About a year ago, I was seeing all these people talking about RGB as far as motherboards were concerned, and I was like, oh my golly, what is this RGB thing? Is this a networking protocol? Is this some kind of like storage system? Oh, everybody's talking about RGB. I have no idea what they're talking about. Oh, I have fallen. I am no longer up with everything. And then I found out RGB is, you know, red, green, blue, and it's for LED colors and things like cases and motherboards, apparently, and graphics cards. And essentially, with computers and cases now, there's all kinds of LED colored lights that people care about. That is definitely a new thing. That is definitely back in the old days, computers were ugly. Computers were ugly. And we liked our computers ugly. But I guess that's a modern thing. So this is going to be something you need to be thinking about whenever you're going to be building a computer is the idea of what is the appearance of the computer going to be and how do you want it to look? You know, do you want it to look like a gaming computer? Do you want it to look like a professional computer? How much time and energy you want to put into it? It's funny, you know, I'm a little snarky every once in a while on Jay's 2 cents, but it's curious. I watch his videos. Oh my golly, just watching him spend all that time and energy perfectly doing like cable management within the case. I was like, wow, that's a lot of work right there. That's a lot of work right there. So for people like me, like I look at clear sides of cases. So that's a bit like that's a big thing now. You know, the glass sides of cases or cases. You know, it has those clear sides. And I never want a computer of mine to have clear sides because I shove all the components in there. You know, if anything's too loose, I may zip tie it just to make sure, you know, they don't hit a fan or anything else. But otherwise, you just shove the components in and then you just shove the side on the case and then you just put it in a corner and you don't worry about the insides. This is one thing that you're going to have to be thinking about, is especially if you're going to be building a computer, is how is that computer going to look? What is the appearance going to be? Do you want RGB? Do you want colors? Again, something to be thinking about when you go out to buy a case. Do you really want the side of your case to be clear? Again, I know what my cable management looks like. I'm you know, Spaghetti Monster blessed, Jay's 2 cents. I'm not going to spend 30 minutes to an hour doing cable management on a computer build. Just not going to happen. And so this is something to be thinking about is if your cable management is pretty ugly, you know, do you want a clear side on it or do you want something with more of a solid side on it? You know, nowadays, again with gamers and all that, this stuff has become much more trendy. You know, I sit there and I watch people. Oh my golly, they talk again RGB and this kind of color and that kind of color, and it's important though. It's important to folks. So one of the things you have to be thinking about with computer cases is, you know, what do you want the computer? Because the appearance of the computer case, just the appearance of it isn't gonna matter. But nowadays there is very much like a status symbol of how your computer looks. So you know, appearance is just something to keep in mind. Now, one of the things you have to be thinking about with computer cases, especially if you're going to be buying a new computer case, is how many hard drives, how many drives are you going to need within your computer? Nowadays, especially now that we have 4 and 6 terabyte drives. Even the solid state drives are 1 or more terabytes, pretty inexpensive. You don't need as much storage as you used to, but sometimes people do want a lot of storage. So if you go over and you take a look at a computer like this particular Corsair, or this case from Corsair, what you can see is that it has a lot of room in here for hard drives. So this, again, this isn't a form factor thing. These are the drives that you'll either be connecting directly to the motherboard, or you'll be connecting to some other kind of a drive controller. But this particular one, I think, can fit something like 8 different hard drives in there. So this is something you have to be thinking about with the size of your computer. So when you're sitting there and you're looking at it, you're like, okay, how many hard drives am I going to be putting in? If I'm going to be doing large RAID arrays, if I'm going to do a lot of large data storage, maybe I need to be able to put 10 drives in this case. If you're not, maybe you only need to be able to put 2 drives in the case. One of the things to be thinking about is how many drives, again, how many optical drives, how many solid state drives, how many 3.5-inch drives, all of these things. Take a look at that to decide what size case you're going to want to buy. Now, one of the functions when you go out and buy a computer case you essentially can pay for is whether it will be toolless or not, or relatively toolless. So what relatively toolless means is when you open up the case, basically when you open up the case, are you going to need tools? Oops. Are you going to need tools to open up the case and be able to add and remove components, or will there be mechanisms built within the case so that you don't have to have tools, so that you don't have to have a screwdriver? So a lot of times the optical drives will be toolless, the hard drives will be toolless. Simply being able to open up the case itself will be toolless. And this is just one of those, how do you want to spend a little bit extra money so that you don't have to pull out the screwdriver all the time? It can make your life a lot easier. On the other hand, it doesn't really help cooling, and it doesn't really help any performance or anything like that. It's just how easy it is it to swap components, and whether you want to spend an extra couple of bucks for it. Now, the final thing to be talking about whenever we're talking about cases is the build quality of the case. Again, a lot of noobs out there, a lot of those very proud 14-year-olds, I would never spend more than $20 for a case. And that's kind of a cool thing, right? In the modern world, you can now buy computer cases, even on Newegg, for $20 or less. And that's a great thing. That's a great thing. I remember when any computer case was going to cost you a hell of a lot more money. The thing is, you get what you pay for, right? You don't think about it. You think, oh, why am I going to spend $100 on a case when I can get the exact same function from a $20 case? And the reason is many times it's aesthetic. And then the kind of like the nitty gritty of being a technology professional. So one of the big things is, especially if you're going to be selling computers to your clients, you're going to be selling them to your clients, leasing them for your clients, building them for your boss. When they pick it up and when they take a look at it, if it looks like something that's high quality, they are going to respect it as being high quality. The reality is you can shove a $20 motherboard, a $40 CPU, a $30 hard drive into a good, nice case, and people will be like, wow, that's a good computer right there, right? You throw a Xeon processor, 128 gigs of RAM, solid state drive, put it into a very inexpensive, cheap case, people are like, oh, you're giving me this piece of crap? Again, right or wrong, aesthetics do matter. How the computer feels is how people are going to treat it. So you spend an extra 20, 30, 40 bucks to put all the components into a nice case, and people will assume it is a much better computer than it possibly actually is. One of the things also to be thinking about whenever you're dealing with cheap cases is, again, you get what you pay for. One of the things that you pay for more expensive cases is that you're not going to need stitches when you go to work on the case, right? So, this is a Dell case. This is the demo case for this thing, and I can go in here and I can rub my hand over all the different metal in here, and I'm not going to have to worry about getting stitches. It is not a joke. I know it sounds like I'm being melodramatic, but when you buy a $20 case, right, if they haven't sanded, if they haven't filed down or rounded off these metal corners, this is just cut metal. Right, so some of these $20 cases, literally, you're putting your hand into a bunch of razor blades, and so yeah, just something to think about. Again, especially if you're going to be maintaining the system, pulling in stuff in, pulling it out, you save $20 now, and how much your stitch is going to cost later. One of the other things to be thinking about when you buy good quality cases is that everything just lines up and works like it's supposed to. Again, having used a lot of inexpensive cases, it may not matter. If you're assembling a case once and then you're never going to have to deal with it again, if things don't line up properly, you hit it with a hammer, you use something in order to make it work just so you can screw things together, that may be fine. But if you're going to be cracking things open, you're going to be opening stuff up multiple times. There are issues where just essentially everything doesn't line up quite how it's supposed to, and so you have to hit or hammer the computer case in order to get everything to go together, and that can be a problem. One of the other things to be thinking about with good quality cases versus inexpensive cases is whether or not the paint easily can get scraped. Now you see this with a lot of those $20 cases. They paint those cases with like watercolor or something, right? You take one little nail or you take one particle of sand and you do this, and all of a sudden you're gonna be scraping all the paint all the way down to the metal. Again, that just looks ugly. You sell a customer, you sell a client $1,000 desktop computer, and it's scratched by the time they take it home. They're gonna feel like they got ripped off. Is it right? Who knows, but that's how they're going to feel. So these are some of the things you need to be thinking about with the build quality of the case. Yeah, again, right? The function, more or less, the functional difference between a $20 case and a $200 case for the components doing what the components are supposed to do, many times there's not a lot of difference. But it's all of these other things where you're going to be putting a good computer together. You might as well get a case that represents the quality of the components that you're going to be putting into it. And that's really all there is to talk about when we're talking about computer cases. I mean, this is what all your components are going to go into, and it's all 2+2 stuff, right? You make sure it's big enough to support the motherboard you're going to put in there. You make sure it has enough hard bay slots for however many hard drives you're going to put in there, enough 5.5-inch or 5.25-inch bays for however many optical drives you're going to put in there. Make sure it has decent cooling, so on and so forth. I will tell you though, again, in the real world, the case is one of those things that gets overlooked way too often. People just don't spend enough time to think about it, but a bad case can be an absolute nightmare. Again, being in Baltimore, you don't know how many times I got paid my hourly rate essentially to clean out the vacuum cleaner that was the computer. Computer sits on the floor, it gets all kinds of crap in it. You've just got to go in there, pull all of it out, and surprise, surprise, it all now miraculously works, right? So again, when we're talking about these computer cases, it's more important than you think. Also, again, when you're going to be selling a computer case to a customer or a client, all they're going to see is the computer case. They don't see the motherboard in general. They don't see the CPU. They don't see the graphics card. They see the case. So if you have a good quality, nice, pretty case, they're going to be like, wow, I have a good computer. If it's a $20 thing, as I say, that already got scratched up simply while you were assembling it, then they're going to be like, oh, I got a piece of crap computer. Same components inside, the exact same components inside, but they are going to feel differently about it. Again, when we start talking about things like toolless cases and how the cases are built, you're going to have to be thinking about, how hard do you want it to be for you to maintain these systems? If you're going to be building, if you're going to be supporting 50 to 100 computers, you have desktop support people running around. Do you want computers that are easy to get into, or do you want something that the desktop support people are going to have to be, just to get into the computer, it's going to take them 10 minutes to figure out how to do it. These are all those kind of little things you have to worry about with the cases. So that's really all there is to it with cases. Again, take time. Don't buy a rack-mounted case unless you're going to put it into a rack. right? Make sure you buy the right case for the job, and if you keep that in mind, you should be good to go. And also, if you go out there and if you're working on computers, again, that may have the wrong case for the function, one of the things you may think about is swapping the components out of whatever case they're in into something more appropriate. This is one of those things people don't think about, especially if you're working for a company, if you're an employee, right? If you have a computer, somebody's using it as a desktop computer, and it's a rack mounted case, just get the go ahead to buy a new case for $50, swap all the components into the new tower case, and then it'll most likely make the end user happier. These are some of the things that you need to be thinking about with the cases. So there you go. As always, I enjoyed doing this class, and look forward to seeing you at the next one.